Uh, we are connected, so I'll make my usual disclaimer that uh, if the feed goes out, it may come back on. Be patient. If it doesn't come back on, sorry. Uh, we are looking in the book of Deuteronomy, and I've said a lot of things. I've repeated myself a lot because Deuteronomy is a repetition, and the word itself means a retelling. But we're going to go around chapter 16, right before it actually. And today, I hope I get to it because I want to, as I've been doing in Deuteronomy, I've not been doing a verse by verse thing, we'd be here forever. But I'm trying to look at topics, some that are not really relevant for us, some I skip over, some I try to point out. But in Deuteronomy chapter 15, actually, there is a section, where did it go? Around verse 10, it's talking about giving. And, well, actually, if you go back to verse 7, it talks about if there are poor people in any of your towns or your land, you should not harden your heart or shut your hand against the poor brother, but open your hand to him and lend him sufficient for his need. Now, this talking about the poor is one of the things that our society and most Western civilizations, well, I should say most civilizations have always made some, I guess you'd say, what would I say, places, organizations, registries for the poor. In this one, though, there's a statement made that Jesus said, and I think as we study, particularly the Torah, I hope that you have seen that a lot of times Jesus quotes these 5 books. And people say, oh, Jesus, that was the way he felt. Well, Jesus was a Jew. He studied these 5 books. He quoted from these 5 books. This law, as it's called, was important to Jesus. And in reference to this, he even said, I didn't come to destroy the law. He said, I'm not going to remove anything from the law, which that troubles a lot of people today. But you got to remember the audiences, and I got to be careful, I'll way digress, but just remember that when you're reading the Bible, you're reading something that was written 3,000 years ago and then revisited throughout history, and then 2,000 years ago, it gets scrutiny through Jesus and the disciples. The writing 3,000 years ago occurred within that cultural frame. The understanding of Jesus occurred within that cultural framework. And now today, here we are 2,000 years later from Jesus, reading and understanding it within our cultural framework. Now the problem is, and this is, I've criticized a lot of people. People say, well, I don't understand the Bible. I said, you're reading it like a 21st century person, and you can't do that. The other problem is you get a lot of people, even preachers, will preach it from a 21st century understanding. I said, you can't actually do that. You have to consider the time and the culture. I had a whole course in seminary called hermeneutics, and that's what it was teaching. And I think it's one of the most valuable courses I had. The funny thing about it, we took hermeneutics, a group of friends and I, and the first thing we did was, our first question is, what is hermeneutics? We took a course, we didn't know what it was. And Professor Bob, he laughed. He said, it's probably the most important and the least understood thing you'll study in seminary. We took a week talking about hermeneutics. And you can sort of, understand it in this simple way. Hermeneutics is learning how to see things through the eyes of the person who wrote it, how to understand things. And to do that, hermeneutics is not just learning that word. You have to study the culture, the habits, the customs of that time period. Now, the best example I can give you is seen in today's lesson, if we get to it, and that is that this was written during the time of the patriarchs. That is, the patriarchs, the old guys of the Bible. You'll find very few mention of women leaders in the first 5 books, because it was a patriarchal society. Now, a patriarchal society has pretty far-reaching ramifications. It's not that they didn't love their wives and their daughters. It's just they saw them in a different perspective. And you could look at a woman and see her as the woman you love. Abraham and Sarah, a very tight, loving relationship. But you can also see relationships where they're simply one step above the cattle or sheep. They are there. Well, go back to Abraham. Abraham loved Sarah more than anyone, and yet he was willing to sleep with Hagar to produce an heir, and that heir would go to Sarah. And we know how that story didn't work out so well. But everything he did was really to please Sarah. He loved her. Even sleeping with a servant girl and having a child. We'd look at that thing, that's crazy. You know, guys say, hey, they had a great system. It wouldn't fly today. Not at all. You know, and but anyway, we see polygamy, which we thought, well, that was fine for them, but not for now. But we have, in the Mormons, you know, they taught polygamy, and they cited the people in the Old Testament. Said, well, if those men could have multiple wives, we can have multiple wives. Joseph Smith went as far as to write into the covenants of the church that to become a god yourself, which is what they teach, you have to have multiple wives. So that's why the Mormons are out marrying everybody. In 1888, they did away with polygamy officially because the U.S. Army was marching on Salt Lake City, was going to wipe them out. And so they had a revelation and said, oh, God said we're doing away with polygamy. The Army stopped. But what they didn't find out until much later was that what they did was they put polygamy in sort of a secret place. Even today in the Mormon church, and they will deny this, by the way, because I've talked to them about it. But I used to have their literature. I still have some of it. They have a book called The Principles and Doctrines of the Faith, which only Mormons get. Well, a Mormon gave me his copy when he left the church. But I found out that even today, if a man sees a woman that he wants to be married to, he goes to the church and marries her, oftentimes without her knowledge, so that when they die, he will call her out in the resurrection. She'll be one of his wives. And I asked a Mormon missionary about that, and he's denied it. And I said, well, just since you don't do it, tell me hypothetically, what if everybody wants to marry the same woman? Who does she belong to? He said, well, since it didn't happen, we don't have to worry about that, but God would determine it. I said, but you're God. In their own universe, they are God. So that's one of the little problems. But polygamy, we don't do it today, and yet Muslims do. You can have up to 4 wives. You actually can have as many as you want that you can provide for. But for most, the average male, it's 4 wives. Yeah. You can have child brides and things like that. Now, before you say, well, that's terrible, it's okay here, too, in this culture. A child could be betrothed to a man. Now, he did not take her as his bride until she was old enough, but she would be his betrothed bride as a child until she grew up, and then she would come and live with him. This was their culture. Women had no say-so until Moses gave them some rights. And that's one of the things about this that you look and think, well, God was starting the process of looking out for everyone equally. 2 things for women in the law that were radical, and one is still considered a bit radical, divorce. Women could not get a divorce. And what Moses set up was that if a man wanted to divorce him, if the woman wanted a divorce, she could petition for a divorce. And all he had to do was write down on a piece of paper, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, and hand it to her, and then she could go anywhere and be divorced safely without being stoned to death. People say, well, that's not such a great thing. Well, you have to understand back then, a single woman in the village could either be a prostitute or be dead. And if she was a prostitute, pretty soon they'd kill her. So she had no options. So divorce saved a lot of women's lives. Now today, divorce is different. They don't want to get into it. But the other thing that Moses did, because God said to do it, is that if a woman is married and her husband dies, she becomes the wife of someone else in the family. But if that person dies and it's just a woman and her daughter or something like that, Moses said, then they can inherit, because women couldn't inherit. If your husband and his brothers were dead, you had to become basically a slave. You would sell yourself in slavery, or you became indentured. And I'll talk about slavery because that's an interesting thing too. But Moses gave them the right to inherit the land, and a woman could inherit the land. But in this passage, it says, verse 10, you shall give freely, and your heart shall not be grudging when you give to him, because the Lord your God will bless you. For there will never cease to be poor in the land. Now, the interesting thing about that statement is these are the people that are coming out of Egypt, going to a land flowing with milk and honey, where everybody's going to have land, everybody's going to be happy. And yet he says, let's be honest, there's always going to be poor people. Jesus said the same thing. He's quoted this. He said, the poor will be with you always, but I'm only with you for a short time. Now, people look at that and they think, well, golly, there's no hope. Here again, culturally, you have to understand poverty and the poor versus 21st century poor, because we have done some perversion of it. And we have what's known as the welfare state, which I know almost sound mean and cruel, but it's a perversion of the laws of poverty. It was never the intent that someone would live on welfare their whole life. The only close to thing exception is, by the way, for women. And that's another thing. If a woman has no provider, and she, particularly if she's old, usually it's the widows and the orphan women, then they can be provided for, but it's not a state-run thing, it's a community thing. You know, it says provide for the women and orphans. In other words, you should give to them. And they had offerings within the temple and within the synagogue that provided for the women and orphans. Nowhere does it say provide for the man. As a matter of fact, Paul, who is one of the most learned teachers of the law, says if a man doesn't work, he doesn't eat. So their welfare state and our idea, totally different. I say that because, to get a little preachy, I think one of the big problems we have is that we create a dependency state where people think, well, I don't have to do anything, I'll just get welfare. I know there are people who have needs. I know there are poor people, and like right now, there's some tough times. But we create part of the problem by giving people enough to where they're satisfied. You know, if I live in a government-run apartment complex where I don't have to pay rent or utilities, and I can't find a job, or maybe I don't want a job, there are people like that. And that flies in the face of most people. It's like, we were brought up with a work ethic. And since we're all white in here, we have white privilege. We can get jobs whenever we want, supposedly. I mean, but this too is a perversion of it. And yet we have minorities and people coming into the country that we're providing housing for. We're now moving toward giving them a monthly wage, not to work. And then we started food stamp programs. I don't think anybody should go hungry. But at the same time, if you're giving someone $1,000 a month in food stamps, free rent, and no utilities, then you've covered their basic needs. California, Oregon, and Washington, D.C. are thinking about starting I forget what they call it, where they give you a wage for doing nothing. So now you go beyond their basic needs and you give them money where they can buy a car if they want to, or, I mean, it's like $500 a month, so it's not a lot. But of course, California's wanting to do $1,000 a month. But imagine if you're someone who you don't really want to work, if you can get in these programs, or, and this is going to sound very sexist, but find a woman who's in the programs, because that's happening a lot. You find a woman who's getting all this stuff and you move in with her. Now, I know I sound terrible, but I worked in Sherrall. Bob knows Sherrall like I do. Dizzy Gillespie and what's the other one? Breeze? Cool Breeze. Yeah, Dizzy Gillespie is there, and then I think it's called Cool Breeze. These are housing developments that are primarily for minorities. There's no white people living in. I took students home from school there, and I was told not to come into these areas. The parents were worried. They said, they will kill you. I said, I know these kids, I taught most of them. So I felt rather secure, but that's the center of drug production, stuff like that. It was designed mainly for people, to have welfare and housing. And what I found was a whole lot of single mothers and kids with no fathers. But there were men living everywhere. That's a perversion of the intent. And the Jews didn't allow that. They had a more logical approach. They said, help the poor, but don't cripple them, with this sort of thing. One more thing, and I'll stop because I thought it was interesting this week on the news. California bought I think it was $160 million high-rise apartment complex to give to street people so they have a place to stay instead of sleeping on the street. Portland is building a $300 million efficiency apartments with 300 units in it to give to street people so they won't sleep in tents. And I thought, that's sort of silly, thinking we're going to get people off the streets now, these tent cities, by putting them in these apartments, when in fact, you're going to attract more street people, and when there's no more apartments, they'll be on the street. So you just doubled your problem. The Bible has a solution, and the solution for the Bible is don't make it a government-run thing, make it church and people. Then the churches, we do that, but oftentimes, we sort of push it off to an agency. But again, and I've told you this horror story, I was minister at the church in Lenore, and we had a benevolent committee, which didn't do anything. They were great at gathering food into the church. And at Christmas time, particularly at Thanksgiving, they said, we need to take this food out to the poor. So they would just take it to people. And I said, how do you know if they need it? Well, look at their house. I said, well, I grew up in a lousy house, but we didn't need food. So I began to contact the welfare board in town, DSS and stuff like that. They told me, we can't tell you. I said, don't tell me. I said, I knew the girl that worked there. I said, don't tell me anything personal. I said, just give me a name or an address, and I'm going to take them stuff. And she said, well, a lot of people want that. I said, okay, tell me what agencies are helping them. She said, I get it. I said, yeah. And so I would call her and I would give her a name sometimes. And she'd say, that people is being helped by these churches, 4 or 5 churches taking them food. At Christmas time, the angel trees, I know everybody loves the angel tree, but it's one of the most abused things ever. I took angel tree presents to a girl one time in an apartment. She had a brand new car, a brand new apartment. When I opened the door, she had presents. The apartment, had a wall about that long, was lined with presents all the way down the wall and curving to the door. And I said, I brought some things from the angel tree. She didn't even notice me. She said, just put them with the others. All of that was angel tree stuff. And what they do, and I say they collectively, not all, but when they get all these presents, they open them up and they take them back and exchange them for the money. So we've got to be more careful with our benevolence. And they set up a system where it was community, just community. It wasn't some nationwide program. But Jesus says there's always going to be poor with you. You take that in consideration. You're not going to stamp out poverty, even though we have a war on poverty. We've had a war on poverty since 60-something or 80-something. We spent 300, last time it was 300 billion, but it's more than that. It's almost $1 trillion on the war on poverty, and there's more poverty. The same thing with the war on drugs, and there's more drugs. I sound political today, but it's not. Politics and politicians are not efficient at handling problems. But anyway, he gives a simple thing here. They talk about slavery. He says if you're a Hebrew man or a woman is sold, they shall serve 6 years. In the 7th year, you let them go free. That was their form of slavery. But they gave a little extra thing. If you look down below there, it says, if you free somebody, in verse 16, but if he says to you, I will not go from you, because he loves you and your household, since he is well off with you. Now here's a slave who they're free, said, I don't want to leave. I like it here. I like you and I like the situation. He said, well, then they become a permanent slave, and you take them and you put a hole in their ear, and they're your slave forever. Now, we see slavery as just the most horrible thing in the world, and Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin. They saw slavery as almost like a job. You know, they had a place to live, they had something to do, and they helped people, and they were given stuff. This is the difference between this century slavery. Now you jump, again, the cultural jump to the Roman era, where they had slaves. Same situation. Many of the slaves were almost like family members and were trusted. They taught the children, they took care of the children, they went and bought the groceries, they were paid a wage to where they could save up money and buy themselves out of slavery, but oddly enough, they didn't. At one time, Rome had almost, I think it was 6 million people in Rome and around the area, and 4 million of them were slaves, because that was just the way to live. See it through that perspective. We all the time are listening to Black Lives Matter say, "Oh, my grandparents were slaves." You know, I'm sorry, I wasn't there. I didn't own you. I didn't own it. There's Henry Gates has a show, and I really don't like it because the purpose of the show is to have white people sit across the table, and then he reveals to them, "You were slave owners," and they begin to cry. And I thought, come on, people, let's get real. None of us are slave owners. None of us, will ever be slave owners. We shouldn't be held accountable for what they did, as my politics for the day. Moving right along in chapter 16 now. This chapter, I'm sorry, it's a little bit boring, but it's talking about, you get the first thing, it says, observe the month of Abib. The month of Abib is when Passover occurs. It occurs the same time every year within that month. It's in the springtime, and it's regulated by the moon. Then in verse 9 it says, count 7 weeks, begin the count of 7 weeks from the time the sickle first put the standing grain. This is a harvest feast, but this is one of the biggies, Feast of Weeks. Then right after that, in 13, you have a Feast of Booths, when you gather to produce your produce from the threshing floor in your winepress. And that's where they literally would go to the temple, and they brought whatever wine, or an offering of wine and grain that they had grown, their produce that they had grown. They built little booths, and the idea was a little lean-to with a cloth over it to look like a tabernacle. And sometimes they'd call this the Feast of Tabernacles, where they would come and they would set up and they would sleep in it overnight at the temple or near the temple. And then they would make their offering of grain offerings and wine offerings to the temple to remember when they were travelers and sojourners. There are more, and I've often wondered why he just gives those two, but those are a couple of the biggies. The other one was the Feast of Trumpets. That's a biggie. But they have all these feasts set up. But for some reason, Deuteronomy only focuses on 2. Verse 18 is another sort of a landmark thing. You shall appoint judges and officers in all your towns. Now, why is that a big deal? Because many of the cultures didn't have this. There was the king's law. And the king's law was the king's law. And if you broke it, then somebody would go and tell the king they broke the law. Well, the king would send a soldier out and kill him. So if you want to get rid of your neighbor, you just say, he broke the king's law. No witnesses, nothing like that. The king was the court and the law. Well, we all know that if you've got a large group of people, you can't just sit there and judge all day long. There was a king's court, by the way. We see the great scene of Solomon where he decides to cut the baby in two. Some people could petition the king, but that's people who lived in Jerusalem. Outside of Jerusalem, they had courts set up according with the synagogue, and they were given judges. Now, this is radical from the standpoint that these will be the men, the elders usually, and they quite often they sat in the gate of the city. Because anybody coming in and out of the city, they wanted to monitor. And so if somebody comes to the gate, you got a guard, and the guard says, hey, I think that's the guy who stole a sheep in the last town. I heard about it. They could hold a trial right there. They wouldn't let him in. Remember in the story of Ruth, when Boaz wants to marry, what's her name? Ruth. And he goes to the gates because he's an elder. And his brother's there, and they do the thing where they give him a shoe and all that story. All that happened in the city gate. But the thing they say here, which I think is in verse 19, you shall not pervert justice. You shall not show partiality, and you shall not accept a bribe. I read that and I talk about culture, and I thought, well, things haven't changed a whole lot. There are, in the last part, there are forbidden forms of worship. They talk about the Asherah beside the altar. This is verse 21. And you don't set a pillar up, which the Lord hates. These were forms of early Canaanite worship where they worship the Baals. And I need to clarify something for you. I think I've done this, but the Canaanite god was El. And they also called him Elohim. A lot of biblical teachers, and again, I sound like I'm picking on my brethren in the ministry, but they get confused. I heard a guy the other day, and he was talking about Yahweh, the name of God, the secret name of God. I thought, it's not the name of God. Elohim, the name of God. It's not the name of God. These are not the name of God. We don't know the name of God other than to say Jesus, because he was God in flesh. Yahweh is an invented word that Bible translators invented in the 15th century. It is not in the Bible. There's 4 letters in the Bible that we added vowels to create the word Yahweh. It's not anything. It's a placeholder for the Jews because they wouldn't write the name of God in their scripture. So they put 4 letters. And those 4 letters, from the 15th century, they tried to translate it because they thought it was a word. And they kept thinking, this is the name of God, but we don't have anything to go by, because in Hebrew, you have letters and you have symbols that serve as vowels. In ancient Hebrew, you didn't have the symbols. It was sort of a understood oral tradition. Later, they added the symbols when they hadn't learned how to read the ancient Hebrew, which is well, you don't want to know, it's Proto-Syrian, but that's no. Anyway, in the 8th century AD, Jewish scholars went back and redid the Hebrew, and they added various symbols so that we'd know the vowel sounds. But there are no vowels in ancient Hebrew, so we didn't know what that word meant. So the translators then took YHWH and they said, let's insert vowels. So what do? What are the vowels? A, E, I, O, U. Well, let's put an A in there. Let's put a E in there, and you get Yahweh. We got a word. And it's killing me how people get up. They named their churches the Church of Yahweh, or they say, praise Yahweh. This guy was talking about the name of Yahweh. I said, it's not that. Tell people. Then we come up with Jehovah. It's like, Yahweh's it. No, it's Jehovah. No, it's Yahweh. No, it's the same word. Because in German, you translate those letters and you get J's and W's, and the W becomes a V in German, so it becomes the Yahweh. It's Jehovah, which is Yahweh, just with German pronunciation. It's the same thing. Anyway, I get frustrated because I thought, you guys went to school just like I did. You should have learned this. Then we have Elohim, which the Mormons used to say is the name of God. When I was first dealing with the Mormons, they said, you don't know the secret name of God. I said, there's Elohim, and one of them about had a heart attack because I knew the secret name of God. And after that, it wasn't about 3 years later, I was dealing with missionaries with the same thing. I said, Elohim. They said, that's not the secret name of God. I said, it used to be. And I found out they had changed it because everybody found out that Elohim is a title. It's not a name. Elohim means Elohim is God of all gods. So that is, you believe, these people believed in multiple gods, but they believed El was the supreme God over every god. So Elohim was a title they gave El. The Mormons thought it was a name. Then they found out it wasn't. So they changed it. I think God's secret name is Adama now. I'm not sure. They may have changed it again. And they probably got a nickname for him like Spike or Buddy. But anyway, so we have these things going on. And the Asherah and the pillars were all to El. They would grow an oak tree. Now, if you know, in Israel, there's not a lot of big oak trees. They have sort of scrubby looking trees. And so if you got a big tree, usually it was something from Lebanon. There's a big forest up in Lebanon. And there, you hear about the cedars of Lebanon, which was a big thing. They grew short, scrubby oaks in Israel. But then when they would try to plant taller ones, and then it was a hardwood. And so they thought, well, God lives in that tree. And so they would go and worship in the oak groves. And when they didn't have a tree, they'd put up a stone pillar and say, God is there. So they'd worship in the pillars. And so you had pillars at every altar point. That's what he's talking about there. Then they talk about sacrificing animals without blemish. Um, don't worship other gods or the sun or the moon or any of the hosts in heaven. That's a dig at astrology again. We talked about that a little bit. People who look to the skies. Now you say, oh, I don't worship the moon. Folks, if you use astrology to determine your future, you're using a worship practice. People say, oh, no, that's not worship, that's just astrology. Worship is a tricky word because worship translates from Hebrew into the phrase of worthiness. So if you give something worth, then you are worshiping it. If you think it's worthy, that's why people say, well, my brother had a 68 Camaro. If he could have got it in the house, he would have slept with it. He washed that car 2 times a day. He waxed it once a week. He wouldn't let you get in it if there was dirt on his shoes. He loved his 68 Camaro. And I dare say he practically worshiped it because he put more time in care of that thing because he said, this car's a classic. It'll be worth something someday. And it's worth every. And I thought, it's worthiness. He loved his car. He worshiped his car almost. And a lot of people like that. We call them obsessed. They say, I don't worship that. I don't think it's real. But worthiness sometimes is determined by what you put your energy into becomes what you worship. And that's why if you become obsessed, and you can do it with people, I've known people, I love my children, don't get me wrong, but I've known people that love their children too much to the point where they almost worship their children. My goal was, I was taught, now you tell me you may be different. My dad taught me that the purpose of a parent is to raise a child up to get them to send out into the world so they can succeed. And when I was a certain age, it was like, you can stay here as long as you want, if you have to. But to me, the message was, I need to get out into the world. I left home. My brothers didn't. I won't give you my whole family history, but they felt they needed to stay home and take care of the parents. And constantly I'd hear mom and dad say, you don't need to stay here. We take care of ourselves. I left, and then I come home, mom says, well, you don't even write. I said, no, I don't even call mom. But I raised my kids that way. I love them, but I wanted them out and succeeding. And so far, knock on wood, they're doing good. But you don't worship people. Now, there's a phrase at the end of verse 7 that I want you to take note of. It says, the hand of the witness shall be put against him to death, and afterward the hand of the people. This is talking about, I need to back up to put it in context. If somebody does some of these things like worshiping stuff, then you bring them out to your gates, a man or woman that's done this evil thing, and you stone that man or woman to death with stones as the death penalty. On the evidence of 2 witnesses, there's the addition. Now you have to have witnesses. You just can't point a finger and say, well, I think she's a witch. Burn her. No, you have to have some witnesses. The one who is to die shall be put to death. The person shall not be put to death on the evidence of 1 witness. The hand of the witness shall be first against him to put him to death. In other words, the guy who's witnessing gets to throw the first stone. Remember Jesus, he said, you who are without sin, you get to throw the first stone. Well, he put a caveat on it that they couldn't meet. And afterward the hand of all the people. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. Now, why do we have the death penalty? It should be a deterrent, even though all the psychologists say it's not, which I don't believe. But why do we have the death penalty?
To get rid of the evil people.
To get rid of the evil people. I was hoping you'd say something different. But a lot of people say it's a form of punishment, but it's really not meant to punish, it's to get rid of evil. If you have someone in your midst who is doing evil, God is likening them to a virus. Since we have COVID, we can say this. That person's evil may spread to someone else, and then you have evil spreading throughout. So you got to get the evil from your place. I'm sure you've thought this way before. You'll see somebody and you think, well, that person's up to no good. Next thing you know, he's got a gang. We do that. I remember Ballantyne started to build a housing project in Ballantyne. And all these rich liberals, love poor people. No,
Mhm.
there will be no housing project in Valentine. They went to the courts, they went to Raleigh, and they put an end to it. So there will be no projects in Valentine. But there are projects in all these cities. Where do you put your projects if you have a housing project?
How far as possible.
Far away as possible. You put them away from where the nice houses are, usually. You don't want them mingling in with good people. Now, that's a little biased, but it's just common sense. Because within these projects are where a lot of your crime comes from. I was talking about Dizzy Gillespie. A friend of mine was a black lieutenant in the police force, and he'd come to my class sometimes, and I'd talk to him. I had lunch with him. And he said, the projects make it a little bit easier for us because when we get a call, we know where to go. He said, we don't have crime in these other neighborhoods. It's Dizzy Gillespie and Cool Breeze. I thought, well, I guess that's the idea. You put the evil from your midst. That's what we tried to do. I actually support the death penalty, even though that makes me not sound very Christian. But the Bible supports the death penalty. If you have someone who is evil, then rather than just banish them, you're sending the evil somewhere else. You put an end to it. In the 30s, we stopped punishing criminals and trying to rehabilitate them. And that means let them go. Well, it's not working, folks. And now we've gone to the totally ludicrous idea of if someone is caught committing a crime, skip bail, just book them and let them go. Now that, by the way, I don't know if you know the history of that law in New York and a couple other places. That law was supposed to be for nonviolent offenses. In other words, if you arrest somebody selling drugs, they're not violent, no bond, just let them go. It saves money because putting somebody in jail makes them a liability. And it's a big liability because you have to provide health, food, everything, housing, a big jail. I understand that. I still don't agree with it. But now, just last week, there was a murderer caught in New York City, and they booked him and let him go. It's like, that's not what the law was about. But now, if you look, if we would put the criminals from our midst, we wouldn't have as much crime. Because you look at the people that get arrested, they have a criminal record as long as your arm. And what the Bible says is put that from your midst so you won't have that crime. It's a proven fact now, even though a lot of people don't want to talk about it because they want to do other things. You're not rehabilitating the criminals. You're letting them go to do more crime. Anyway, the Bible talks about that. Now, in verse 14 of chapter 17, just a little interesting thing. It says, when you come to the land the Lord has given you and possess and dwell in it, I will set a king over me like all nations are around me. You may indeed set a king over you whom the Lord will choose, one from among your brothers to set the king. You may not put a foreigner over him who is your brother. Well, they broke that in the coming of Jesus. But here's really basically a prophecy of the coming of Saul. And later Samuel will say, you don't really want this. But Moses saw, he said, you're going to do this. He knows human nature. And Moses was a prophet, probably he was going to do it because you're going to get a king. And the only thing he doesn't say is it's not going to work out. They go on, it says, don't acquire for yourselves excessive gold and silver. And it's talking about the king, and he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away and not acquire. Well, this is what you should do, but they didn't. Verse 18 says, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book copy of the law approved by the Levitical priest, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life. He shall learn to fear the Lord God by keeping all the words of the law and statutes and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, he may not turn aside the commandments, either the right or left, so to continue along his kingdom. Now, you read that section, Moses saying, this would be a good king. You read the king's biographies, every one of them failed. Saul, David, Solomon. The only one maybe that did, well, there's two, was Josiah and Hezekiah. You don't talk a lot about these guys, but if you read Hezekiah, and I can't remember the verse, but there's actually a verse where it says Hezekiah was the best king that Israel ever had. It's like, no, it's David. But Hezekiah was faultless. Josiah was one of the best kings because he was the last good king, and he humbled himself and returned to the law. But you look at all the kings of Israel, it's like there's a lot of them, and those are the only two that stand out. We've done chapter 18 because there's where I talked about the abominable practices the other day of sacrifice to Moloch, divination, sorcerers, charmers, telling us the really bad stuff. And then in chapter 18, it's the test of a true prophet. We talked about that. Chapter 19 talks about the cities of refuge, where, and I've talked about that too, you've got these places where if you commit a crime, even by accident, like if I'm driving and somebody steps out in front of me and I run over and kill them, that's an accident. I didn't kill them on purpose. But because I shed their blood, in the ancient custom, you had, the family had to avenge that blood, even if it was an accident. And so every family had one person selected as the avenger of blood. And so if I'd run over that guy, this guy would hunt me down and run over me, even though I did it by accident. And so that custom was ingrained so much so that they put in the idea of cities of refuge. So if I did something unintentional, I could go to these cities, and if this guy follows me, I could even go to the local synagogue or find a temple and put my hands on the horns of one of the temples, like they have these temple basins with cows. If I put my hands on it, it's like home free. You can't touch me. And if he kills me there, he dies a horrible death. And sometimes his whole family suffers. It worked out pretty good because it cut down on the constant flow of blood for avengers. But they didn't do away with the avenger of blood. But they gave refuge cities. Now, this guy, if I'd done it unintentionally, I could go anywhere I want. But if I find out that the avenger has found me and is following me, I run to a refuge city, and there I can live. The problem is I have to live there the rest of my life. I can't leave because that guy will be waiting outside, and they did. This custom still goes on in Islamic countries. You still have the avenger of blood. In this chapter also, the last thing in it is the famous lex talionis. If you want to know what that's called, that's the Latin for it. Your eye shall not pity it. It shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Vengeance. And that is called the lex talionis. That was the law of the land for a lot of people. But as you see, the lex talionis is there that if you're going to take vengeance for someone, it should be equal. In other words, if we're fighting and he chops my hand off and I say I submit, then the avenger of blood can chop his hand off or put his eye out, stuff like that. In other words, you can't go and kill somebody if they just wound you, but you can wound them. It sounds a little weird, but remember, culturally, we're dealing basically in a pagan society. This was considered a way to prevent a lot of bloodshed. Also in chapter 20, they have rules for fighting, such as in verse 4, for the Lord your God is he who goes out with you to fight for you against your enemies to give you victory. If a man built a new house that's not been dedicated, he can go home. If he's planted a vineyard and he hasn't had any of the fruit, he can go home. If he's been engaged or betrothed, he can go home. If he's scared, he can go home. You think, that's not going to work too good. If we're going into Afghanistan, one of the guys says, I'm sort of afraid of those crazy people. Well, you can go home. Everybody go home. But the reason is that first thing, it says, God is he who goes out with you to fight for you. We don't fully understand that. We have incidents in the Bible where the Ark of the Covenant goes before the army and lightning comes out of the Ark of the Covenant and kills the enemy. In other words, the army just watched. And it's like, God fought for them. We have instances where the people will attack and they kill everybody, and when they add up the casualties, nobody's dead. Only they're dead. And it's like, how did we do that? Israel was always outnumbered. And yet they went into battles that they didn't lose a man, but they killed everybody. That's got to be the hand of God. There's another section in here which seems to contradict places. But verse 10, when you draw near a city to fight it, offer terms of peace. Well, earlier it says, when you fight, kill everything, man, woman, child, and beast. But there's a caveat. These cities that you're going to fight, these people are not pagans like the others. And we don't fully understand who they are. But like places like Jericho, kill everything. Knock the city down, kill everybody. But Ai was a city they were going to kill everybody, but they tricked them and they made a deal. It's like, well, the covenant's more important than you being dead. But they say that all the people who are found in it shall be forced labor for you and shall serve you. So in other words, if you come to a city, you offer them peace treaty and they accept it, then they become laborers for everybody. And what they did literally was these people would go out, they would chop wood, they would gather water, they would help gather in the grain for the Israelites. They became a workforce, but it was better than dying. The other places, down at the bottom, verse 16, but in the cities of these people, the Lord is giving you for inheritance shall save alive nothing that breathes. And these are the people of the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, Hivites, and the Jebusites. One of the big jokes in seminary, one of those weird jokes, it's not really funny, was what happened to the Jebusites? Because you can trace the history of everybody. The Jebusites just disappeared. They were wiped out really good. Some archaeologists say they found Jebusite cities, but once the city's destroyed, it's like those people were killed and disappeared from the face of the earth. The Hittites, their culture was incredibly strong and still going on. Now, I want to do these real quick. I know it's time to go, but chapter 21 is one of my favorites. Chapter 21 talks about somebody who's found dead in open country, and the two towns nearby have to go in. Remember I told you about the belly button law? This is the belly button law. This is the initial law that says the town that's closest buries the guy. Later, when somebody said, well, most of his body was close to that town, they didn't want to mess with him. A well-known rabbi in the Mishnah came up and he said, well, we will measure from the center, the belly button. So whichever town his belly button is closest to, that's the town that has to bury him. And they call it the belly button law. I'm thinking about this and I thought, who is measuring from a man's belly button all the way to Great Falls to see if Great Falls buries him or if Kershaw buries him? But that's what they did. That's the belly button law. You have a law here about marrying female captives that says you can, and then the inheritance law. The one that bothers me is verse 18. If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey his father, blah, 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 look down. If he's a glutton and a drunkard, in verse 21, then all the men of the city will stone him to death with stones. And look why? To purge the evil from your midst. You're going to see that phrase pop up a lot. Chapter 22, there's just some various laws here, but look at verse 5. A woman shall not wear a man's garment. Ladies who are wearing pants today, give me a rock.
Different culture.
That's right. Nor shall a man wear a woman's cloak, and whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord. Cross-dressing, transgender. You know, it's in the Bible. It's sinful. But we can't say that anymore, or we're homophobic and we're all this stuff. And I don't know what we're going to do, because y'all saw this week where the acronym for the gay and lesbian movement has changed. I can't say it all, but it's something like SIILGBTQA something, and they're adding all kinds of things. I don't even know what it is, but it's like, so in other words,
Trudeau is really going to have a problem with that one.
but it's like you might as well just not say anything to anybody unless you've known them your whole life, and even then, yeah, you might run into a problem. But it says here that is a problem. That's abomination. This word abomination, I use it in Levitical law, and this probably should go over in Levitical law. But I think it's interesting. I told you this before. Homosexuality, incest, bestiality, they're lumped together. And those are three sins that are all abominations. Now, what is an abomination? Well, you can define it in a modern way, but an abomination then, as it is today, is just something that is too hideous to even consider. And yet, we have entire groups now that say, this is who I am. I want my rights. I'm persecuted because of this. Until, I think it was 73, I used to say 76, but I think it was 73, homosexuality was considered a mental neurosis, and you'd be treated. And then a group of psychiatrists had one of their conventions in San Francisco. I never did find out if they were all gay, but they decided they would remove that from the list of neurotic behavior. And they do that on occasion. Transgender used to be a mental illness. That's not anymore. Cross-dressing, not anymore. I tell you folks, and here's my evil prediction of the day, but I think that pedophilia is going to fall under that heading one of these days. Because y'all remember Barney Frank from Massachusetts? He's in Congress anymore. He was first openly gay congressman. And I did a study. My doctoral thesis had a section on homosexuality, by the way. And so I did all this research, and my mentor then took it out. He said, that's been done. But I did the research, I wrote the thesis, and I found out Barney Frank put a law before Congress that they wanted to lower the age of sexual consent to 8 years old. And he thought that children should be able to choose to have sex with adults at 8. The Congress said no, so he changed it to 12. And believe it or not, they debated it for a long time because a lot of guys agreed. And I thought, that tells you something about Congress. It stayed into the hands of the state. And that's what sort of saved it. The state determines, because like some states it's 16, some it's 14, and some it's parental consent. I know in one state, a child can marry at 12 if the parents sign. But this is where they're going with this. Barney Franks had a lobbying group that nobody had ever heard of until, I forgot his name. The reporter used to be on 60 Minutes. Anyway, he did an expose on it called NAMBLA. Ever heard of NAMBLA? Mm-hmm. Mary has. They did a whole show on this, and this is back in the 80s. NAMBLA, and he said that it's the North American Man-Boy Love Association. And they did one of these things where they took a camera and they found out where they were meeting, and they went in to this 2-story building, and they just opened the door and they said, we're here from 60 Minutes, we'd like to do an interview. All these men went flying out the door, covering their face. One actually literally jumped out the window. And when they went back and looked at them, they were all upstanding members of the community. We're not talking about perverts. We're talking about lawyers, judges, all this stuff. NAMBLA was secret. But today, when there's a gay pride parade, usually you'll see a NAMBLA float at the end of the parade. They're coming out of the darkness. They're not ashamed to admit that they look for children to have sex with. This is the stuff that all this was considered abominable. And Moses wrote laws against it. I got to stop. But I just point that there's a lot of things that go on in our country you don't know about because it's not heavily publicized, it's not well publicized. But we as people, particularly as Christians, we need to be ready to stand against it because these things get passed into law and they get put through simply because nobody's paying attention and nobody's speaking up.
That's the whole problem.
Yeah. And when they get passed.
And they put it in the middle of that 15,000 pages.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what we're dealing with right now is, they want to pass that infrastructure bill, which they've already said is only about 20 to 30% infrastructure.
Right.
The rest is stuff that people would not believe. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to find out what it is. If y'all remember Obamacare when it passed.
Oh, yeah. You better read it.
It was.
Now, what's in it?
Yeah.
Pass it, no, what's in it?
Did anybody actually, Mary, did you try to read it?
No.
I did. The problem with the bill was I downloaded a copy. I thought, I'm going to read this thing. Well, it was incredibly long. But the thing that got me was I got through about 4 or 5 pages because every paragraph was not part of the bill. It said, this refers to section A, blah, 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 to another law. And it's not listed. You'd have to have a book, law books, and go look them up. And it's just page after page of this refers to this refers to this. That way, you'll never find out what it says if you're just trying to read the bill. And that's how legalese get slipped through. But like I say, I got to go. Let's have a word of prayer, and I'll let you folks go home. I apologize. I talked too much, way too much. Heavenly Father, we thank you and we praise you for this day. We thank you, God, and praise you for the opportunity to come together and study your word. We see the wisdom that has been inspired into people like Moses and these writers. Lord, we just pray for that wisdom today, that they would seek your will in our laws, not their will, not their desires, but the will of God to be done. And maybe I'm dreaming because those days seem to be in the past. But Lord, we thank you that we can still study your law and have access to you through the Holy Spirit through our prayers. Lord, remember the folks we mentioned today, and I pray your blessings upon each person in this classroom that's been here with us today. In Christ's name I pray. Amen. I left out my phrase today.
I think we had 11 counting Gene and Davis. We get to count them now.
Okay.
So,
And
they were watching.